Well, it is hard to believe that we have already come to the end of the meeting. It goes by so quickly. But I want to again thank the elders for bringing me out. Thank you very much for bringing Bonnie out. She has already had to fly home, but she certainly enjoyed the time to be here, and we both did. I'm not just saying this. You hold a special place in my heart. You are a very special congregation, and you are very special both to Bonnie and me, and we're very thankful when we get to come and be a part with you. I hope that the series has been beneficial. I want to also thank the people who have provided for Bonnie and me, provided food. Thank you so much, especially those who thank you so much for helping her through her diet and encouraging her and not making it harder for her. You have been wonderful in that regard. Barry and Sarah, thank you so much. You are family, and I'm glad that we're family. Well, I began the series by saying you don't need to listen if you're perfect. And I'm going to end the series saying you don't need to listen to this lesson under the condition that you never suffer or you don't know anybody else who has suffered or will suffer. And of course, if that's the case, everybody knows we have to listen to this lesson because we all suffer. We all go through challenges and pain, and that is a really big obstacle. Many people lose their faith during times of great suffering. It is, in fact, what Satan expects you to do. I mean, isn't that what Satan's doing with Job? Satan is saying, you know, Job serves you, God, but as soon as you let me at him, he'll stop serving you. And when Satan thinks, let me at him, Satan is thinking, I will take away all that he has, all that he cares about, and I will take away all of his health. I will make him suffer until he quits on God. That's Satan's plan, and things have not changed. Suffering is a challenging time for us, and that has been going on for a very, very long time. And so we're going to look at Lazarus here in a little bit in John chapter 11, but before we do that, I want to talk about the philosophical dilemma of suffering. I remember being in philosophy class, whether it was in high school, which was non-religious, or when I went to FC and you talk about philosophy class, you always come up with the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. And while those are technically different things, I really think of them as the exact same. They make the same basic argument, and they're not new arguments. It's not like we had recent philosophers who suddenly said, you know what, suffering proves there's no God. This is an old argument. In fact, there's this guy named Epicurus who comes 270 years before Jesus, 270 BC. And he's a Greek philosopher, and he's still going to have followers nearly 300 years later. So whatever his doctrine was, it had a profound impact on the Greeks. And so 300 years later, when Paul is in Athens, he's arguing with the Epicureans, with the people that hold to the doctrines of Epicurus. And he had some interesting ideas. Some of them would kind of ring true to us today. Happiness is not what you have, but enjoying what you have. Right? So he got this idea of contentment. That's not about how much possessions you have. It's about the attitude you have towards your possessions. Makes sense to us. Made sense to a lot of them. He also had other ideas, and that is that life is about being happy, and therefore you should not allow a life of suffering. And so he would look at Paul, and Paul made no sense to Epicurus and to his followers. Because Paul keeps going to city and is suffering, being persecuted, and he keeps doing it, which by their definition is insanity. Well, we don't have any of Epicurus's actual writings, but we have some old quotes. And David Hume quotes on Epicurus, says, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil?" Now that's a little bit more complicated than the way I learned it, but again, evil, suffering, they're pretty much interchangeable here, but it's this. If God is all powerful and God is all loving, then there would be no suffering. But since there is suffering in the world, therefore either God is not all loving, God just doesn't care that we're suffering, care enough to stop it, or God is not all powerful and he just doesn't have the ability to stop it. And if God is not all loving or God is not all powerful, is he really God? And that's the argument. Well, I don't think it's very smart of us to judge God in such ways. Trying to understand God is a very challenging thing to do. God is almighty. God is omnipotent. God is way bigger than we are. And it's a really bad idea for us to stand in judgment of him and say, well, this is the way God ought to be, and this is what God ought to do. Having said all of that, it's a legitimate dilemma. And we all feel it. I think we've all gotten to that point and we're saying, where is God? Why is God letting this happen to me? And so when we go over to John chapter 11 and we look at the resurrection of Lazarus, it struck me one day that the resurrection of Lazarus isn't so much about the resurrection of Lazarus as it is about the suffering that's going on around him. And it really struck me one day when I realized that it is dealing with this philosophical dilemma. Remember, Epicurus has said it nearly 300 years before Jesus comes on earth. It's not like this is a new concept, like nobody had any idea about this way of thinking. So when we look at John chapter 11 and the problem of suffering, the first thing we need to keep in mind is that when we see Jesus, we see God. Jesus comes on earth as the exact representation of the Father, of his nature, in Hebrews 1 and verse 3. In John 14 and verse 9, his disciples, and I'm sure Jesus was quite disappointed when this happened, they said, "Show us the Father." And Jesus says, "How long have I been with you, and you haven't understood? If you know me, you know the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." So when we go through John chapter 11, and we look at the behavior of Jesus, he is showing us the Father. And he is showing us the Father in the context of suffering. So, in John 11, what we have is the suffering of Lazarus all the way up to the point of death. He dies. But that's not the end of it. We see the suffering of those who are around them. We see family members and we see friends and their suffering as they watch Lazarus be sick and they're worried about him. And then they watch as he is dead, and they feel the pain of his absence. It's a chapter about suffering. So let's take a moment, and I know it's a long reading, but let's read it with our minds thinking about Jesus and the problem of suffering. Is he all loving? Is he all powerful? Why is the suffering happening? Start in verse 1. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." But when Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." This he said, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep." The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, so that we may die with him. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So she said to him, Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. When she had said this, she went away and called Mary her sister, saying secretly, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? So Jesus, again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, Remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, says to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. And Jesus said to her, Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And the man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. And so we have the resurrection of Lazarus. But did you see the play between love and power going on there? So what I see is actually a really challenging part to this. Jesus' attitude is really challenging. So Jesus has willfully allowed the suffering to happen. He's allowed the death to happen. He's allowed them to suffer for an extended period of time. Because they come to Jesus and they say, Your friend Lazarus is sick. And Jesus waits 2 days before he does anything. Now, if I got a phone call saying, Bonnie, was in an accident and needed my help, I quit the sermon. And I'm going to go. And I don't think any of you guys are going to blame me. Because we understand this idea of love. If our loved ones need us, we drop everything and we go to them. We go to help them. And Jesus says, he's found out about it, and he waits 2 days. And then says, all right, let's go ahead and go. And Jesus isn't ignorant. It's not like he's thinking they're exaggerating. He knows Lazarus has died. He knows that at that moment, Martha and Mary and the friends and the family are gathered together, and they're weeping and they're crying and they're missing their brother. And of all things, our Lord says, I'm glad I wasn't there. I'm glad that happened. That's challenging. And everybody there, though, knew he had the power. It is not like anybody looked at Lazarus and said, oh, Lazarus is really sick. Lazarus has that one illness that Jesus doesn't have the power to overcome. 3 times in here, it is stated, if Jesus had been here, this wouldn't have happened. They all had faith. They all understood. He has the power. He could have prevented this. So Martha comes to him, and Martha says, if you had been here. And Mary comes to him, and Mary says, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. And then the bystanders in verse 37 said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? They knew Jesus had the power. Aren't they basically saying, Jesus, where were you? We needed you. Why weren't you here? That's the same question we're asking. Where's God when we suffer? So Jesus allowed the suffering to happen, but there's just no question that he had the power. Over and over throughout there, they understood that Jesus had the power, and if we had any question about whether Jesus had the power, what does he ultimately do? He resurrects him from the dead. Jesus had the power. I feel like I'm missing a slide. That's okay. Oh yeah, so I've got a bad title. Please forgive me for that on the slide. So Jesus had done so much already, no one could deny that he could resurrect this person. Again, look at verse 37. Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? They're not questioning his power. They're saying he's already done this. He can do it. They actually don't even fully understand. I don't understand why they don't, but they've missed something. Because in Luke chapter 7, you remember you have the centurion's servant, and the centurion is sending for Jesus. And all the Jews are telling them that this centurion, he's worthwhile to go and help him. He's been really good to us. Why don't you go help him? And the centurion sends to Jesus, says, no, don't come to my house. You don't need to come to my house because you have power like I have authority. All I have to do is speak, and my guys go and do what I need them to do. And this man, who is not a Jew, has amazing faith because he says, I've got this servant, I need Jesus' power, but all I need is for Jesus to say, he's better, and he will be better. And so how this could have played out is they could have sent servants to Jesus to say, Lazarus, the disciple whom you loved, is sick, and Jesus could have said, no, he's not. And that's all over. Jesus has even more power than they seem to be recognizing. And then ultimately Jesus resurrects him from the dead. There's just no question about his power. And so Jesus has all power, but suffering is still occurring. Nobody in this story is going to go and say, Jesus therefore isn't Lord. They see that Jesus knows. They understand this. They've seen Jesus be told, your friend is sick. They hear Jesus talk about the fact that he has died. And they see Jesus' behavior. And nonetheless, in verse 8 and verse 28, they come to Jesus and they still call him teacher. They call him rabbi. And nonetheless, they still call him Lord and their master. And he's called Lord by those who thought he was simply too late. So in verse 21, Martha gets there, Lord, if you had been here. In verse 27, she again says, yes, Lord. In verse 32, now it's Mary, and Mary comes to him, and Mary says to him, Lord, if you had been here. In verse 34, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. In verse 39, he says, remove the stones. And Martha says, Lord, is there any question about their respect and honor of Jesus despite what's happened? He's still God. He's still the Son of God. He's still the Messiah, despite what has happened. So certainly what problem we're going to run into is it's got to be love, right? So in the chapter of suffering, Jesus' power and his authority is not called into question at all. But what about his love? Maybe it is that he just didn't care enough. And isn't that what was emphasized throughout this story? Throughout this account? In John 11 and verse 5, now we've skipped this because in verse 3, they appeal to Jesus saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But maybe they were just wrong. But it's verse 5 where John tells us, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Jesus loved. Down in verse 33, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. We do not see Jesus being cold-hearted and uncaring. Deeply moved. In verse 35, the most quoted verse, and whenever a Bible teacher says, all right, you get to choose what Bible verse you want to memorize. Everybody, John 11:35. Jesus wept, right? Oh, that is such a powerful verse. It may be really easy for a kid to memorize, but it is a powerful verse. And it is showing Jesus is not heartless. He is not uncaring. And the bystanders, that's what they notice. They remember his power, but they say in verse 36, so the Jews were saying, see how he loved him. So Jesus has just thrown our problem upside down. And Epicurus and the philosophers, they're missing something. They've got some principle, something wrong with what they're saying. Jesus had the power to prevent the suffering, but it still happened. He had the great love, but the suffering still happened. So somewhere in there, Epicurus is just wrong about something. What's the answer then? Well, we find out that there are reasons for suffering. We find out that there's a big picture for suffering. I mean, when you read John chapter 11, as you read this and you take the chapter as a whole, is it a sad, depressing chapter? I don't understand Bonnie and some of the women who like watching movies that make you sad. I don't get that. I like watching movies that make things blow up. That's kind of my preference, right? But is this one of those movies? Is this one of those chapters where it's you hear the story and you're going through and at the end you're like, oh, and everybody's crying and it's so sad? This is an incredible story. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges and difficulties like all great stories have, but in the end it's happy. It's a happy ending. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28 teaches us that's exactly the way all of life is for Christians. There are moments where things are filled with sorrow and pain and difficulty, but in the end, it says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. That is a terribly misused passage sometimes. Terribly misused. Sometimes people have read that and they said that all things are good, and that's not what that passage said. And sometimes Christians are terrible comforters because they think that and they say awful things to people. I've known of women who've lost their children have died, and somebody comes up to them and says it was good. No, it wasn't. It's not good. But it will become good. That moment, that pain, that agony, that sorrow, that loss, that's not good. But when we get to the big picture, when we get to the end, when we look at it from God's perspective, seeing the beginning to the end, we'll look at it and say, our life is not a tragedy. For Christians, our life is a triumph. In the end, there is eternal life. In the end, there is heaven where you are in the presence of God and He wipes away every tear, and there's no longer any separation, and there's no longer any sorrow or any death. And in that moment, in that place, we can look back at our life and it will have been a happy story. Not in any one of those moments, but in the end, in its totality. And Romans 8 and verse 28 says, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. It's not that all things are good, but in the end, all things will be good. And Martha understood that. Martha's feeling the agony, and she's not going to say, this is a good moment. But when she sees Jesus, she says, I know that in the end, He's going to be resurrected. She knows that there's this better, happier ending. Of course, with Jesus and with God, it doesn't have to be the end. For Christians, we have this hope of eternal life. We have this hope that when it's all said and done, it'll be okay. But God can make it okay anytime. So she's thinking, eventually Lazarus is going to be resurrected. And she says, I am the resurrection and the life. You want him resurrected? I can do it right here and right now. And he goes and he does it. And it becomes a happy story because Jesus can do it right then. But the answer to the problem of suffering is we don't look at it at one particular moment. We've got to look at the big picture, at it in its totality. And we can see that in the end it is good. In the end, the pain and the suffering is worthwhile because we do suffer for a reason. Now, that doesn't take away the pain, but sometimes that can help. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the pain is a result of your sin, and that, of course, is just no comfort, right? In John chapter 5 and verse 14, Jesus has healed a man, and it says, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. So Jesus has just acknowledged sometimes our pain and our suffering is a result of our actions. We have done something to cause pain. And of course, if we look, we can find sometimes our actions can cause pain for other people. Other people suffer because of what we do, and there's just no comfort there. I mean, that is not the way I'm going to go and comfort somebody and come and say, come here, hug in. This is your fault. I mean, that's just not going to work. It is true, and it is worth our consideration if we're suffering to stop and think, did I cause this? Have I upset God? Job spends a good bit of time wondering, did he upset God? And then he examines himself and says, no, I didn't. I don't understand what's going on. But while his friends are accusing him and they say, you did this, this, and this, he says, wait a second, I didn't do this, this, or this, or this, or this. I didn't upset God. I don't understand. But it's worth asking. It's worth stopping and saying, have I upset God? But that's not the only reason. In John chapter 9, there was this man who was born blind, and the disciples are really struggling with that because they have this idea that people suffer because of sin, and yet this man was born blind. He's born suffering. Was he born sinning? And so his disciples said to him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? And Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned, nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Jesus says there's other reasons besides sin. And isn't that the case with Lazarus? Jesus let Lazarus suffer and die. Jesus let his friends and his family die, but for a reason. So in John chapter 11, look at these reasons, look at these passages. In verse 4, they said that his friend is sick. This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Remember in verse 15 where Jesus said, I am glad? Jesus did not say, I'm glad they're suffering. He says, I'm glad for your sake that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. There was a reason, and that reason was faith. This moment, this suffering, this pain, it's going to have a purpose. It's going to result in faith. And boy, does it. Verse 40 and 42, Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it so that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus is doing all of these things to bring people to faith. Verse 45. We stopped in verse 44. Here's the follow-up, verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw that what he had done believed in him. And then we talked about this morning in John chapter 12. You know, when the rulers are going to go and say, hey, people are believing in Lazarus, believing in Jesus because of Lazarus. Let's go kill Lazarus. Remember that? Verse 9, the large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. Let's pull Lazarus out of the grave for a second. Let's pull him out of heaven. Let's put him on the stage and ask him, was it worth it? And if Lazarus, having come from heaven, can start counting the people that are there because of what he went through, I'm convinced Lazarus would say, yes. Lazarus, would you do it again? And I'm convinced his answer would be yes. Once he got the big picture, once he could see how many people were coming and having their souls saved, how much pain and agony for eternity was saved by his few hours of suffering. And I believe Mary and Martha would be exactly the same. Once you see the end, once you see the beautiful picture, the pain, as difficult as it is, becomes worth it. So the answer to suffering. 2, I don't have all the answers to suffering. I know that there can be purpose to it. I don't know what your purpose is. And like Job, we may never find out while we're on earth. Job just never finds out. But I know this: suffering doesn't change who we need. You may wonder where God is. Where was he? Why is he letting this happen to you? But it doesn't change that he is still the only answer. He is the only one to turn to. He is the only one that can solve it. Imagine if Mary and Martha didn't send for Jesus. As soon as they heard that he waited what? 2 days? No, he does not come in our house. They will still be in suffering. He was the only solution. And so they fall before him and they don't understand. And they're in pain. And they're saying, Lord, you could have prevented this. And he could. And ultimately he did. Don't turn your back on God when you're suffering. When you're suffering, you should be reminded how much you need him. He's the only answer. But that is not the most profound answer to suffering. I don't know what all the answers are. But in John chapter 11, the passage in which we see the exact representation of our Father's nature, when we see God in the flesh showing us how he is, how he feels, what he does, this is what I learn about suffering. Our God is the God who suffers with us. You know, we're sorry comforters sometimes. We want to have some magic thing to say, something to take away the pain. That's not how it works. When somebody's suffering, just join them. Job's friends did really good for a week. They just joined him. They sat down and said nothing. When you look at what's stated about Jesus, in verse 33, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. Why? He sees the big picture. He knows what he's about to do. The resurrection's right around the corner. He doesn't say, it's all going to be okay. That's not what he does. He knows the bigger picture. He knows the number of people that are going to be saved because of what's about to happen. That doesn't matter. Because right then, right there, he sees their pain and he feels pain. And that's how God is. When we hurt, he hurts. And so he says, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. And it doesn't make the pain go away, but it sure does help me to know when I'm filled with sorrow and agony and loneliness and whatever the suffering may show itself to be, God sees and God feels, and he joins me. Even though he sees it all, he joins me. And so when God has commanded us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, he has only commanded us to do the very thing he himself does. He weeps when we weep. And that is my answer to suffering. And that is great comfort to me. And I hope it'll be comfort to you as well. Well, we've come to the end. Had a good morning. Had a young man who decided he wanted to follow Jesus. What a joy that is. I hope that all of us will make the same decision. If you're not a Christian, now's the time to become one. Don't wait for the message to go away. Join the God who truly has power and love. The power to remove your sin, the power to overcome the problem of death. Join Jesus. And if you're not a Christian, if you're a Christian and you've fallen away, I hope you'll come back. He's still the one you need. But this invitation is not for a few, it's for all. Let us all be resolved. I will follow Jesus. I will follow him wherever. I will follow him through whatever. He is all I need. Let us follow Jesus, and in the end, let us join together in a joyous, wonderful hug in heaven, where we have all gotten there, and we all see it was so worth it. Why don't you answer the invitation as we stand and as we sing?